Hello and welcome once again to another edition of Spiritism, a closer look. A couple of weeks ago, we finalized the first topic that we picked, and it took us 25 weeks working on that topic. Evolution, as you know, evolution is a huge thing. So we spent about 25 weeks on that subject. So we finally made it. Today we start something different. We start a new topic, and the reason why we picked this topic, it has to do with our going throughout the country and doing lectures and speaking to people in Spiritist centers and just discussing Spiritist issues here in the U.S. A lot of times, people come to us and they ask us something in this sense, more or less. I understand Spiritism started in France. How did it make its way into the U.S.? How come? And why did it start in France? So why not anywhere else? Why not even in the U.S.? So, we can give you a straight answer in one paragraph maybe, but it's going to be fragmented. That's not what we wanted to do. We want to go deep inside, investigate, spend time, and get to a clear understanding of how Spiritism made its way into the U.S. coming from France. So welcome once again to Kardec Radio. I'm Luis Lima here in Florida, and we start now our program number 1 for Spiritism, a closer look, and we are going to call this From France to the USA. So welcome to From France to the USA, program number 1. It is very important that we understand how things progressed, and there's of course a lot of history that we need to touch on and different points of time. History in general, history of humanity, but especially history in certain countries and certain places. So we're going to use timelines, and I think we're going to spend about maybe 6 to 8 weeks to cover the whole thing. And of course, your participation is always welcome. So we are here to answer questions and participate with us, please. Thank you, Bruce, for joining us from Portland, Oregon, the other side of the country. I'm in Florida. So beautiful. Nice to see you guys participating. Okay, so I want to show you something here. I want to show you this, okay, the world map, representation of the world map. And a lot of times, our question is how Spiritism started in France and made its way into the US. Well, that's not really what happened. That's not what it is. It's a little different than this. It all starts the other way around. Spiritism starts, we're going to cover this in detail. This is just the initial overview, I would say, so we can get started. Spiritism has its roots and starts actually in the US. And it gets shifted. I'm going to use the word shifted because that gives us a better idea of what happened. So it shifts to France. From France, it shifts to South America and Brazil. And from Brazil, it starts to, I'm not going to say shift, but it starts to propagate and made its way into the US. So there's a lot of things to be discussed just by looking at this image. We can see, we're going to have to know and understand and comprehend some of the timelines, what is happening. We need to put things into context. So we need to know what was happening in the US, in France, in Brazil. We're going to touch on history of these countries, on the timelines that will matter, plus a global understanding of why Spiritism made its way at the time that it came by, in the mid-1800s. Why not in the 1300s? Why not 50 years from now? So there's a reason for that. Everything falls in place, and we want to explore all of this. We want to explore this avenue to see, uh, to detail this so it gets clear for all of us. And the whole thing starts in 1848, right here in the US. The starting point of Spiritism is considered to be the same that is the starting point of what we call modern spiritualism. Spiritualism, the idea that there's a soul and life after death and all of that, it's something that didn't start in 1848. It's from very early days of civilization, humanity. But what we call modern spiritualism, and that triggers in about 1848, is the idea that there's more about spiritualism or spirit or soul, whatever word you want to use, that needs to be investigated from a more rational point of view. We want to learn. We want to sit down, look at facts, look at events, research, and come to a conclusion. So there's a little bit of rationality in it. That's why we call modern spiritualism. So 1848, right here in the US, modern spiritualist begins. Spiritism is a form of spiritualism. So that's why we Spiritists consider 1848 to be the starting point, the triggering point, let's say, for Spiritism. So what happens in 1848? Well, something very interesting. In Hydesville, state of New York, Hydesville is a small town about 20 miles outside Rochester, New York. And in 1848, actually March 31st, strange things start to happen in one of the houses in the city. The house belonged to the Fox family, and it was a married couple with 3 children. The children's names were Leah, Maggie, and Kate. Leah was older than the other one. She was already 35 when this thing happened. The other girls, Maggie was 15 and Kate was 11. So they were still young girls. And they started hearing noises around the house for no reason. Noises that they couldn't identify in the first approach. So they were a little bit suspicious. They asked each other, "Did you hear this? Did you hear that?" And they did. They heard this, they heard that. And to a certain point that the noises became, more intense, not only in the noise itself, but the type of noise. So not only loud, but the type of noise. So these were raps and as if somebody was knocking on doors and windows and just making noises. And the girls, like I said, they were 15 and 18. So they were getting a little bit afraid, to the point that they were afraid to sleep alone. So it kind of started to impact their lives, at least in a minor scale at the time. But then the noises and these raps, they became really intense. So the girls decided to play along. So they would hear one noise, they would knock on the doors, for example, to make the equivalent noise. They would hear 2 knocks, so they would respond with 2 knocks. And this created like a very primitive form of dialogue. That's what they thought. We're communicating here with whatever this is. They didn't know at the time. So we are communicating. So that we are kind of transmitting some information. So the thing goes on. It starts to be something closer and closer apart from one time to another. So they called the neighbors. So the neighbors got into the house. All the neighbors were able to see that happening, to hear those noises and all of those. And the thing, word gets out there. It's a small town, a small city. So shortly after that, everybody knows. So the house was always filled with people, curious people, willing to know what there was. They wanted to hear the same things the girls were listening to and hearing. So to a point that, it became annoying for the girls. So they were getting afraid. They didn't know how to react. They didn't know what to do. And the raps did not stop. But they developed this kind of primitive form of dialogue, as I said, with raps and number of knocks. And one knock means a yes to a question. Two knocks mean no to the question. So they were verbally asking questions to this, I'm going to call entity. That's what they call at the time. So they were asking questions to this entity and saying at the end of the question, they would say, if it's a yes, knock once. If it's a no, knock twice. And, the thing was happening. So there was some dialogue taking place in there. There was some communication in there. So a few years later, actually a few months later, with the number of knocks, they were able to develop, I would say, a primitive form of an alphabet. So let's say, for example, an A is one knock, a B is two knocks, a C is three knocks. So the dialogue was formed of spelled words, letter by letter. Okay, so all the words were actually letter by letter, using number of knocks. And they were able to figure out what was happening. That was a spirit that died 5 years prior to 1848, when the whole thing started in March 31st, 1848. So this came to place 5 years after the death of the entity communicating. And the entity gives out his name. It was Charles Rosman. And he said, I was murdered for money 5 years ago, and my body was buried 10 feet deep in the cellar. So with that information, that became very serious. That becomes almost like a legal matter now. So the girls and the family actually calls the police to investigate, and with the information given by the entity himself, they were able to dig and do some excavations inside the house, and they did find a body. They did find a dead body in one, pressed against one of the walls. So that's very interesting. That's very interesting. This thing, almost exclusive to that house at the time, started happening in other places in the country, not in the city, but people were reporting here and there something similar with knocks and raps and different noises. So it was becoming, something popular, I would say. But you see, the Fox sisters, they were young girls, so they were being pressed. Right? They were under a lot of pressure from police and from those who didn't believe in any of that. So they would not, give the information. They would not sustain their position. So they suffered a lot. They had to go through a lot of bullying to, because of the situation. But that doesn't change the fact that it all happened. And it did. It all happened. So when we discuss things like this, okay, when we have to understand all of that, we need to follow certain procedures to establish why things are happening. People in this country at the time that believed in the girls, and they were listening to other people, and they were hearing that the same thing was happening in other places. They were actually flying to these, not flying, but going to these other places to see, and they were seeing it. So they believed it. So a small, I would say, modern spiritualism movement formed because of that. And these people, these spiritualists at the time, They wanted answers. They wanted to study and see what that was and why they were, suddenly that thing started. You didn't. Why didn't it start 15 years ago? Why didn't it start 200 years ago? So they were looking for answers. They were looking for an explanation for that. While that is happening, these people leading the, I'm going to call investigations, okay, leading these investigations or going after the answers, they start getting reports that the same thing, maybe in even greater intensity, is happening across Europe. Things are happening in Germany, similar things are happening in Belgium, France, other places in Europe. And these people said, well, that's interesting because it's not only here in America, it's also happening in Europe. And there was a difference between this thing happening here and happening there. In here in the US, if you look at the time, 1848, there was a lot of pressure from the religious movements, organized religion movements, to not let this thing afloat. There was a lot of people that believed to different segments of religion, Catholic, Protestants. They would not like this thing to be out there. They didn't like the idea of having people in the streets talking about it. So they made it really difficult for the dialogue about what's happening to take place with a lot of pressure. So these spiritualists that were here in the West trying to get their research done, trying to get more of the facts, going to different places in the country to gather more information, more facts, they were having a hard time. So they said, well, maybe we have to move to Europe because in Europe, they are not facing the same barriers and the same difficulties that we are facing here. So it might be, they started considering, and that's in the 1848, 49, 50. So they started considering moving altogether to Europe because they think they're going to have a better shot at accomplishing their goals, which is knowing what this is and getting the answers, getting explanation. And with time, more spiritualists were gathering. They were joining the initial movement, coming from different states, different places in the country, all going around the area, New York, state of New York, until a point that they decided to really leave the country and just move to Europe altogether, all of them, and try to continue their research in Europe. That's what they did. And that took place in about 1850, 51, and 52. There was a period of time that makes this happening, going to Europe. So modern spiritualism starts here in the US. The starting point is considered the Fox sisters in Hydesville, but it quickly moves to Europe. And then, like you saw in the beginning, it's going to circle around. It's going to go to France, then South America and Brazil, and then back into the US. So as of next week, we are going to start with how these people, how these spiritualists moved from the US to Europe and how the whole process gets triggered. And we are going to go, like I said, into several different timelines. We need to analyze a little bit of what's happening in France at the time, especially France. We're going to have to talk about Brazil, a little bit of history in Brazil. When I say history, we're not pretending to be historians. That's not the point. But we need a bare minimum history that we can plug into the equations and it makes sense. So things can be well explained without any holes. And then we're going to talk a little bit about history in Brazil at the time, and then how the movement comes out of Brazil, feeding other countries in South America and in the US. more recently. So I invite you to follow us every week here. This is a weekly program that we do every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Every week we publish a question, the question of the week, and that question is a trivia we call Spirit Trivia. So at the end of it, every session that we do, at the end of every meeting like this one, we publish a question, and we invite you to participate with us. We actually, if you go to the site that you see here, weekly.spirittrivia.com, there's going to be a question in there. It's totally, 100% anonymous. We do not collect any names, email addresses, IP addresses, and nothing like that. Nothing. You just go in there. You're going to see there's a question and 4 or 5 options, depending on the question. Just participate. Just cast your answer. Nobody's going to know that you listening to us is casting your answer. We do not collect any information from you. But we are all studying. So it's good information for everybody anyway. So participate with us. Go to spirittrivia.com and cast your answer for tonight's question. So for next week, like I said, we are going to start in Europe in the early 1850s, and how the whole thing starts. So be prepared for a lot of history and some very interesting timelines. Thank you very much for participating with us here at Kardec Radio. Spiritism, a closer look. That was our program number 1 for the series Spiritism from France to the USA. And I'll see you next week. Thanks so much.